So, as I was reflecting over the past several weeks on Advent and the Christmas story and how love shows up in it, I began to focus on Mary, Jesus' mother. She certainly provides an example of love and courage, and I think that there are some fresh ways to reflect on the Christmas story and Jesus' life that we can see in her example. What do we learn about Mary's love for God and then for Jesus through the story of Christmas and of Jesus' later life? How do we see God's love reflected in Mary's example? How do we see these same themes later in Jesus' life? First, we see Mary's example of submission and obedience to God's calling on her life. Mary's obedience comes at a personal risk. Matthew's account of the story tells of how Joseph planned to put her away quietly. We know from other sources that she could have been at risk of stoning if Joseph made her presumed adultery public knowledge. Yet, she chooses to obey. After Jesus is born, Simeon promises that in loving Jesus, a sword will pierce Mary's soul too, presumably when Jesus dies. Yet, hearing of this pain to come, she chooses to love her son. Jesus later also follows this example of obedience at personal cost, most obviously at the cross, but also as we reflect in this season in the Incarnation. He who dwelled in eternity now took on flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood, as the Message translation puts John 1. Jesus himself points out the close link between a love of God and obedience in John 14. If you love me, keep my commands. I thought for each of these points I would give us some questions to consider. And then I'm going to pause for a minute or so to give you a chance to consider. Sometimes in the midst of Advent, we're so busy with all the preparations for Christmas that I think we don't have those pauses. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself. So it'll give us a chance to pause and think and listen. Is there somewhere that your love of God and his love of you is calling you to deeper obedience, even perhaps at personal cost? Is there somewhere that you have shied away from risk? Social risk, financial risk, relational risk, physical risk, that you can now move forward in submission to God's calling? Mary provides us an example of the rewards and sometimes the pain that can result. I'll give you a minute. Second point of reflection. Mary believes the angel's incredible words of the miracle that she will soon experience. A virgin will conceive and bear a son. She doesn't understand how God's message could possibly come true, but she believes. Sometimes it's helpful to have someone else's support when you feel that tug to believe something incredible. In Luke's account, Mary does seek support from someone else, maybe the only other person alive at that time, and who would understand her story and her experience, Elizabeth. And in the power of the Holy Spirit, Elizabeth commends her for her belief in what God said to her would happen. Mary also believes in God's character and God's work throughout history. Sorry, this ended up a little busy. She lifts her voice to sing of her love for this God and his work, lifting the humble and scattering the proud, filling the hungry and sending the rich away empty, repeated and fulfilled in her own life and story. She hasn't seen it happen for everyone yet, but she has seen a glimpse of it starting in her own life, and she proclaims it in faith. Lynn Cohick, the author of the book Women in the World of the Earliest Christians, states, Mary reminds us that God acts mercifully and redemptively, and that sometimes it takes eyes of faith to see that. Jesus also echoes this faith, that miracles can happen and that God is at work. He himself performs the miracles. The water changed to wine, the sick healed, even the dead raised. And he also sees God's hand fulfilling promises in his own life and ministry. Good news to the poor, recovery of sight for the blind, setting the oppressed free, proclaiming the year of God's favor, as he announces in Luke 4. I found a passage from a Jesuit father online that went through actually this Magnificat. So I'm just going to read it, and it talks about how it lines up with Jesus' ministry. The Magnificat is a kind of overview of what the reign of God would be like, or is like, a reign that her son would inaugurate 30 years later. All the things that she mentions her son would do. Jesus in his public ministry scatters the proud in their conceit, numerous times, as in his dealings with many of the scribes and Pharisees. He casts down the mighty from their thrones by showing Herod and Pilate who the true king is. He lifts up the lowly, not only in his preaching, but in his healing. Remember that the physical movement in the healing of Peter's mother-in-law and Jairus' daughter, just to take two examples, is described as a lifting up. He takes them by the hand and lifts them up. He fills the hungry with good things at his multiple feeding miracles, thousands of people at a time. He sends the rich away empty, among those who think themselves rich in knowledge but are revealed as poor. Especially in John's Gospel, those who think they know are ignorant, those who think they see are blind, those who think they are rich are poor. Finally, Jesus' ministry helps his servant Israel by living out God's promise of mercy. So it's just neat to see the connections between his ministry and Mary's Magnificat and praise to God. Mary's story reminds me of her faith when she accepted her calling, but it also reminds me of God's faith when he entrusted himself as a baby to a young woman in risky circumstances to fulfill his promises to his people. God knew that circumstances would be challenging for Mary and Joseph, the census, the flight to Egypt, international travel, and adjustments. I'm sure that pregnancy, labor, delivery, and infancy were just as risky in those days as they still are in many parts of the world today. And yet he chose to work through them, carrying this risk himself in this particular just right prepared moment of history to show his love and to bring the hope, peace, and joy to the world he had created. Is there something that you're struggling to believe that God has shown or told you? Is there someone you need to talk with or spend time with that could help you believe? Is there something in Mary's song or Jesus' life mission that calls to you? If you had to sing your own Magnificat, praising God for what God has done for you, what would it sound like? reflection. God works in love to fulfill his purposes through Mary's acceptance, courage, and faithfulness beyond her wildest dreams. Who would have thought that one simple yes would result in further angelic visions to Joseph, leading him to first marry her and then flee with her to Egypt? Who would have thought that her choice would lead to the fulfillment of other people's lifelong hopes? God's choice of this faithful young woman results in the poor and humble shepherds being the first to hear the good news of Jesus' birth. Mary's response results in Simeon, who has hoped for the consolation of Israel and seeing the Lord's Messiah, now dismissed in peace. It causes Anna to find hope and fulfillment as she looked forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. Israel herself finds her deepest hopes fulfilled in unexpected ways through Mary's brave choice. It's encouraging to me to see how Mary sticks with Jesus and with God, even when she doesn't understand what's going on. In contrast to Zechariah, she sets aside her confusion and startlement and accepts the angel's announcement. When shepherds arrive with a story about angels in the sky and mysterious wise men show up bearing unexpected gifts, she receives them and ponders these events. Later, Jesus disappears for several days in the big city and then states that he had to be in his Father's house, to his parents' confusion, as if they should understand. And she just packs him up, takes him home, and thinks it over. Mary is okay to let God be God and herself not be God. She entrusts herself to the one who loves her and her people and finds him to be enough and so much more. It's a challenge to my own pretensions to idolatry and a strengthening of my faith. Jesus also allows us to see God's fulfillment in ways that exceed our expectations. I'll bring up here some nativity paintings that I found that were in non-Western contexts, some of them, outside perhaps of our expectations. Jesus' first coming was certainly not what the disciples or Israel expected. His death and then his resurrection were both unexpected. His fulfillment of his kingdom bringing through his imperfect people of the church in the intervening centuries has also not been what the church expected. But Mary's story gives me hope that God will one day fulfill the as yet unmet expectations, just as that baby 2,000 years ago fulfilled promises of God's love in unexpected ways. Are there places that God is asking you to hope or to trust beyond your expectations? Are there places that you struggle with God not meeting your expectations, like the disciples and Israel did? Can you see ways that your choices of faithfulness might help fulfill others' dreams and hopes? Is God calling you to stick with him even when you don't understand? To let God be God and you not? consider and celebrate anew the story of Jesus' first coming as we look forward to his second coming. May we have ears open to hear God's calling and obey, even when it involves taking risks. May we believe God's promises to each of us personally and to all of us as his people, and trust that he knows the truth when he says that he can begin to work out his promises through each of us. May we trust that God will work in love to fulfill one day his purposes for salvation and justice and healing and resurrection and fullness of life beyond our wildest dreams.